Picture this. It's October 14th, 1806. A dense, wet fog blankets the rolling fields near Auerstedt. Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout, commanding 27,000 Frenchmen, is marching north. He believes he is moving to cut off the retreat of a defeated Prussian army. But the fog begins to tear apart. What Davout sees is not a defeated flank. It is the entire Prussian main army, 60,000 men, led by their king and their most famous general, staring right at him. Miles away, the Emperor Napoleon is fighting what he thinks is the decisive battle. He is wrong. This is the story of the man who won Napoleon's hardest battle and received almost no credit for it. To truly understand the victory at Auerstedt, a battle won against odds of more than 2 to 1, a battle fought almost entirely in the blinding fog of war, you must first understand the man who won it. He was not like the other marshals of France. He was not the flamboyant theatrical cavalryman like Joachim Murat, a peacock of a man who rode into battle dazzling in gold lace, emerald green uniforms, customized leopard skins, and towering ostrich plumes. He was not the charismatic, hot-blooded, instinctive warrior like Jean Lannes, the man whom the emperor loved as a brother, whose raw courage was a physical force, and whose men would follow him into the very mouth of a cannon. This was Louis-Nicolas Davout, and he was cold. Born in 1770 to a minor aristocratic family in Burgundy, he was a man forged by paradox, a man who belonged nowhere. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, he did not flee with his class to join the counter-revolutionary armies of the émigrés. He embraced the revolution. He abandoned his title, his privileges, and his king, choosing instead the uncertain, bloody future of the Republic. This single choice, made in his early 20s, defined his entire existence. It made him an outcast, trapped between two worlds. The remaining royalists, the nobles who returned under Napoleon's later amnesty, saw him as a traitor to his blood, a class turncoat who had betrayed his own. The new radical revolutionaries, the men who had risen from obscurity, saw him as a ci-devant, a former noble, forever suspect, his aristocratic origins a stain that could never be fully washed away. He was even imprisoned during the Terror, escaping the guillotine only by luck. Davout learned early that he could rely on nothing but his own unbending will and his sheer, brutal competence. He had no powerful faction. He possessed no easy charisma. He had no talent for the political manoeuvring, the flattery, and the backroom dealing that saved lesser men. He had only an iron will and a mind that saw warfare not as a glorious pursuit of honour, but as a ruthless, complex problem of engineering and mathematics. His appearance only enhanced this image of a cold intellectual. He was famously, almost debilitatingly, nearsighted. He squinted at the world through thick spectacles, a rare and almost comical sight on a Napoleonic battlefield, where image and bearing were half the battle. He looked more like a provincial schoolmaster or a severe bank clerk than the man who would become the emperor's most feared executor. His manner was awkward, brusque. His voice was harsh. He did not charm, he commanded. While other generals cultivated the love of their men through grand gestures, shared rations, and familiar, earthy nicknames, Davout demanded something far more difficult, and perhaps more valuable: perfection. He was given command of the 3rd Corps of the Grande Armée, stationed for years at the camp of Boulogne, preparing for an invasion of Britain that would never come. It was not the best corps when he received it. He made it the best. He drilled them in the mud and the ceaseless weeping rain of the English Channel coast. He drilled them until they hated him, and until they were perfect. While other corps relaxed, their discipline fraying in the long, boring peace, the Third Corps trained. While other marshals allowed their men to live off the land, a polite and often brutal term for organised looting that terrorised civilian populations and created enemies everywhere the army went. Davout insisted on iron discipline. He hunted down stragglers with his own patrols, often appearing in the dead of night to inspect a sentry post. He famously paid for supplies, shocking local mayors who were used to being plundered. He had his own men shot for disobeying orders on foraging. His corps became a machine, a flawless instrument of war. His men marched faster, carried their equipment better, and maintained their formations under fire with a terrifying, almost inhuman precision. They did not love him in the way men loved Lannes. They feared him, but they trusted him completely. They trusted him because they knew two fundamental truths. Davout never wasted their lives in vain, and Davout never lost. This absolute discipline extended to his own character. In an era of spectacular, almost cartoonish corruption, where marshals like Massena plundered entire countries for personal art collections and fortunes, Davout was incorruptible. He managed his corps' finances with the same obsessive, pedantic detail he applied to a battle plan. He famously died in debt, a rare and startling distinction for a marshal of the empire. This severe, unbending, relentless character earned him his nickname, Le Maréchal de Fer, the Iron Marshal. He demanded iron discipline from his men because he demonstrated it in himself. He was harsh, but he was also meticulously fair. He ensured his men were paid on time. He ensured their rations were full. He personally inspected their boots, their greatcoats, and their shelters. He understood, perhaps better than any of them, that an army fights on its stomach, and that a soldier who trusts his equipment and his officers will fight twice as hard. His relationships with his generals, men like Gudin, Friant, and Morin, were not based on friendship, but on total professional respect. They were the finest divisional commanders in the army because Davout tolerated nothing less. They were an extension of his own will. And what of his relationship with the emperor? It was perhaps the most unique and most professional relationship Napoleon ever had. It was not based on the fiery, emotional friendship he shared with Lannes, whom he had known since the first Italian campaigns. It was not based on the indulgent, exasperated affection he had for his flamboyant brother-in-law, Murat. Napoleon respected Davout. He respected him because Davout was the only one of his marshals who seemed to function with the same relentless, logical, obsessive precision as the emperor himself. He was the only one who could be relied upon absolutely to execute a complex order to the letter, no matter the difficulty, no matter the cost. Davout was the man Napoleon pointed at the most difficult problem. He was the anchor, the rock, the pivot upon which the entire Grande Armée often turned. He was the man you sent to hold a flank against impossible odds, as he would later prove at Borodino, holding the line against the main Russian assault. He was the man you ordered to march his corps 100 miles in 48 hours, to arrive at the decisive point of a battle, as he did before Wagram. He was not a man of glory. He was not a man of charisma. He was a man of results. His mind was a tactical ledger, and the only thing that mattered was the final balance. As the campaign of 1806 against Prussia began, Napoleon gave Davout the critical, independent task. The emperor was moving his main force to strike what he believed was the main Prussian army, concentrated near the town of Jena. While he, Lannes, and Augereau prepared to deliver this hammer blow, Davout's Third Corps, along with Marshal Bernadotte's First Corps, was ordered to march north. Their mission was clear: sweep around the Prussian flank, seize their main supply depot at Naumburg, and cut their line of retreat to Berlin. It was a vital strategic mission, demanding speed, endurance, and perfect execution. It was a mission designed for Davout. Napoleon trusted him to execute it flawlessly. What neither man knew was that this flanking manoeuvre was about to send the Iron Marshal not into the enemy's rear, but directly, blindingly, into their face. The campaign that led to Auerstedt, the battle that should be remembered as Napoleon's true masterpiece of destruction, began not with a bang, but with an act of supreme, almost suicidal, arrogance. The year was 1806. Napoleon Bonaparte, fresh from his paradigm-shattering victory at Austerlitz the year before, had shattered the Third Coalition and broken the armies of Austria and Russia. He had remade the map of Germany. He now dominated Central Europe, but one power remained unbroken. One power stood defiant, untested, and utterly, blindly convinced of its own superiority: Prussia. For half a century, the Prussian army had lived off the reputation of a ghost, the ghost of Frederick the Great. They were not just an army in the minds of their aristocratic officers. They were the army, the inheritors of the sacred, invincible legacy that had humbled the combined might of Austria, France, and Russia in the 7 Years' War. Their discipline was legendary. Their infantry, moving with the mechanical, high-stepping precision of a clockwork automaton, was considered the finest in the world. Their cavalry, led by the sons of the Junker aristocracy, believed itself the heir to Frederick's legendary charges. Their tactics, the precise linear formations and the famous oblique order, were taught as inflexible, almost religious, gospel in every military academy across the continent. They were a perfect, glittering museum piece, an army frozen in 1756, about to face the storm of the 19th century. And they knew it, or rather, they thought they knew it. They looked at Napoleon's Grande Armée as a chaotic mob, an undisciplined, revolutionary rabble of conscripts raised from the mud, led by an upstart Corsican adventurer who won battles through luck and sheer, vulgar weight of numbers. They saw the new French tactics, the use of skirmishers, the flexible, self-contained army corps, the reliance on speed and individual initiative, not as a revolutionary evolution in warfare, but as a lack of proper breeding and discipline. The Prussians would show them how real soldiers, how gentlemen fought. In Berlin, the war party held almost total sway, centred not around the weak-willed king, but around the charismatic, incandescent, and beautiful Queen Louise. She was the political and emotional centre of the resistance. She hosted salons where young, ambitious officers gathered to dream of glory and toast the inevitable march to Paris. She publicly shamed the king's cautious ministers, calling them cowards, whispering that their prudence was nothing less than treason. At her side were men who embodied this reckless romantic arrogance. Men like Prince Louis Ferdinand, the king's cousin, a handsome, dashing figure who saw war as a glorious extension of the hunt, a chance for personal honour. And then there was the fiery 64-year-old cavalry general, Gebhard von Blücher. Marshal Vorwärts, they called him. General forward, a man of limitless courage, animal instinct, and a burning visceral hatred for the French. Blücher was not a man of complex strategies. He was a man of the charge, who believed that any problem could be solved by riding straight at it, sabre drawn. Together, this faction pushed the hesitant king toward the abyss. They were tired of Prussia's humiliating neutrality. They were desperate, aching, to prove that the spirit of Frederick was not dead, that they, his heirs, were still the masters of war. In a famous theatrical gesture of profound contempt, a group of these young officers gathered outside the French embassy in Berlin and began to sharpen their sabres on its stone steps. It was a public, deliberate, and ultimately fatal insult. They demanded war, and they were about to get it. In October 1806, Prussia, having finally allied with Russia, issued a stark ultimatum to Napoleon. This document was the pinnacle of their hubris. It did not negotiate, it commanded. It demanded that Napoleon withdraw all French troops beyond the Rhine River by October 8th, or face the full, undivided wrath of the Prussian army. The ultimatum was a masterpiece of bad timing. It was so arrogant that it left no room for diplomacy, and it gave Napoleon, a man who lived by timetables and precision, a precise, ticking clock. He now knew exactly when his enemy intended to strike. Napoleon, then in Paris, read the ultimatum with almost comical disbelief. He had not wanted this war, not now. His army was resting and refitting after Austerlitz. He was trying to consolidate his new German confederation. But if Prussia insisted on its own destruction, who was he to deny them? He saw the Prussian army not as the invincible force of 1756, but as a brittle, hopelessly outdated relic. "I will be in Berlin in a month," he declared. The Prussians, he supposedly remarked to his marshals, were a museum piece, an army that had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. Their commanders, he noted, were old, and he was right. The Prussian High Command was a committee of feuding ghosts. Their councils of war were paralysing exercises in indecision. The Duke of Brunswick, their commander-in-chief, was over 70 years old. He was a veteran of the 7 Years' War. He remembered the bloody fields, the endless campaigns, the grinding cost. He remembered when a single battle, a single mistake, could cost a kingdom. His entire strategy was based on not losing. He favoured cautious defence, fortified positions, and slow, methodical manoeuvres that protected his precious, perfectly polished army. Opposing him was Prince Hohenlohe, ambitious, arrogant, and convinced that Brunswick's caution was nothing short of treason. Hohenlohe, backed by the younger firebrands, wanted to attack, to meet the French head-on in a glorious Frederican battle that would settle the matter in a single afternoon. And caught between them, utterly paralysed, was the king himself, Frederick William III, a man who radiated indecision. He was on the field with the army, a fatal mistake for a non-military monarch. He would agree with Brunswick's plan for a cautious retreat in the morning, and with Hohenlohe's plan for a reckless attack in the evening. The result was that the Prussian army, in the face of the fastest-moving military force in European history, simply marched back and forth, confused, split, and led by no one. Napoleon's plan, by contrast, was a model of devastating speed and singular purpose. He knew, as he always did, that his greatest enemy was time. The massive Russian army, Prussia's only real ally, was mobilizing. It was marching from the east, hundreds of miles away. But it was coming. It was a glacier. Slow, but unstoppable. If the Prussians waited, if they played for time, if they drew him into a protracted campaign in the mud of northern Germany, those Russian armies would arrive. The war would become infinitely harder, infinitely more costly. Therefore, Prussia had to be destroyed, not defeated, not pushed back, annihilated, and it had to be done now. He unleashed the Grande Armée, almost 200,000 men, in one of the most brilliant strategic manoeuvres of his career. He did not move them in a long, slow, single line of march, dependent on ponderous supply wagons, as the Prussians did. He moved them in what he called the bataillon carré, the battalion square. This vast formation of multiple, self-contained army corps moved on parallel roads. A living, breathing organism. A square of corps, each one a complete army in miniature, with its own infantry, cavalry and artillery. This formation allowed him to move with incredible speed through the difficult, forested terrain of Thuringia, all while remaining flexible. The carré could pivot in any direction. If the enemy was found on the left corps would pin them, while the centre and right corps wheeled to envelop them. If the enemy was found in the centre corps would attack, while the flanks folded in. He called it his leopard's pounce. As the first days of October passed, the French army plunged into the dense, dark woods of central Germany. They moved faster than any army in history had ever moved before. While the Prussian High Command was still holding councils of war near Erfurt, still debating whether to advance or retreat, still shuffling their armies back and forth in a confused, indecisive panic, Napoleon was already in their rear. He had moved with such speed that he had completely outmarched them. He had outthought them. He had burst through the mountain passes of the Thuringian forest and severed their primary lines of communication back to Berlin. The Prussian army, the pride of Europe, the invincible legacy of Frederick, was trapped before a single major shot had even been fired. The first true shock came at Saalfeld on October 10th. Prince Louis Ferdinand, the golden boy of the war party, the man who had sharpened his sabre on the French embassy steps, led a reckless, unsupported cavalry charge against the advance guard of Marshal Lannes. It was glorious, it was chivalrous, and it was idiotic. The French infantry, veterans of Austerlitz, did not panic. They formed squares and shot his cavalry to pieces. The prince himself, fighting in the melee, was cut down in single combat by a French quartermaster sergeant, killed on the spot. The news of his death sent a wave of shock and despair through the Prussian headquarters. This was not how it was supposed to go. This was not the glorious, easy war they had been promised. This was something new, something terrifying. By October 13th, Napoleon had arrived near the town of Jena. His scouts reported a massive concentration of Prussian troops on the plateau ahead. This was it. This had to be the main army. He began to gather his corps, calling in Lannes, Augereau, Ney, and Soult for the killing blow. That night, Napoleon himself climbed the steep Landgrafenberg plateau in the dark, personally sighting his artillery, peering through the gloom at the campfires of the army he believed was the entire Prussian force. He had found them. Tomorrow, at Jena, he would personally annihilate the legacy of Frederick the Great. But war is a fog of deception, and the Emperor, for all his genius, was about to make the single greatest miscalculation of his entire military career. The night of October 13th, 1806, was cold and sharp. On the windswept heights of the Landgrafenberg, a rocky plateau that dominated the town of Jena, the Emperor of the French peered into the darkness. His world was compressed to the view through his telescope, and what he saw through that lens confirmed his every assumption. Below him, on the plain, twinkled a massive constellation of enemy campfires, thousands upon thousands of them, stretching for miles, an entire army caught in the open, seemingly oblivious to the trap that was about to close. This was it. This was the moment he had planned for, marched for, and hunted for. This was the Prussian army, the vaunted legacy of Frederick the Great, delivered into his hands by their own arrogance. He was, contemporaries noted, almost giddy with anticipation, radiating an electric, manic energy as his staff, working by the flickering light of lanterns, struggled to keep up with the torrent of orders he dictated. He had them. His plan, which he finalized in those late night hours, was simple, brutal, and based entirely on this one, single, fatal assumption. The army below him, which he estimated at perhaps 70,000 to 100,000 men, was the entire Prussian force. He would annihilate it at dawn. He had already called his marshals to him. Marshal Lannes, commanding the 5th Corps, was already on the plateau, his men having performed the superhuman, back-breaking feat of dragging dozens of cannons up the steep, rocky, goat-path-like tracks in the pitch dark, a task Napoleon himself had overseen, lantern in hand. Lannes, the eternal vanguard, the man who always led the first attack, would form the centre. Marshal Auerstedt, with his 7th Corps, would form the right wing, moving to envelop the Prussian flank once Lannes had pinned them. Marshal Soult and Marshal Ney, commanding the 4th and 6th Corps respectively, were marching hard and would arrive during the morning to complete the encirclement, to crash in from the north and west, turning the battle into a slaughter. It would be a textbook Napoleonic victory, a second Austerlitz. A crushing hammer blow delivered by over 90,000 French soldiers against a trapped, disorganized, and badly led enemy. He would shatter their centre, envelop their flanks, and drive the survivors north, straight into the path of the corps he had sent to slam the door. But to ensure that this destruction was total, to guarantee that not one Prussian regiment, not one standard, escaped the trap, Napoleon needed to slam that northern door shut. He needed to cut the main highway to Berlin, the Prussian line of retreat. For this critical task, he looked to 2 men, Marshal Bernadotte, commanding the 1st Corps, and Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout, commanding the 3rd Corps. Their orders were dispatched by frantic, hard-riding aides-de-camp through the cold, dark night. The 2 marshals were, at that moment, several miles to the northeast, near the town of Naumburg, having already successfully seized the main Prussian supply depots in a brilliant opening move. Their new instructions were clear, yet they would become the most lethally ambiguous orders of the entire campaign. They were to march west at dawn. They were to cross the river Saale, march through towns like Auerstedt, and position themselves firmly, unbreakably, on the Prussians' primary line of retreat at Apolda. Napoleon's map, his entire mental model of the war, showed this as a march into the enemy's rear. He was sending them to catch the survivors of the glorious battle he was about to win at Jena. He was sending 2 corps, perhaps 46,000 men in total, to mop up a routed, demoralized army. What the Emperor did not know, what his cavalry scouts under Murat had failed to tell him, what his own all-conquering genius had failed to grasp, was that the 70,000 campfires he saw from the Landgrafenberg were not the main Prussian army. They were not even most of it. They were only its flank guard, a secondary, isolated force commanded by Prince Hohenlohe. The real Prussian army, the main body of over 63,000 men, including the King, the Duke of Brunswick, their entire strategic reserve, and the bulk of their veteran infantry and heavy cavalry, was not at Jena at all. They were 15 miles to the north, in the darkness and the fog. And they were marching directly, unknowingly, catastrophically, toward Marshal Davout. This intelligence failure is one of the most profound in military history. How did it happen? Napoleon's cavalry, his eyes and ears, had been brilliantly commanded by Murat in the strategic pursuit, but had failed utterly in the tactical reconnaissance. Murat, the King of Naples, was the greatest cavalryman in the world for a pursuit, a glorious hunter of broken armies. But he was a terrible scout. He craved the glory of the charge, the capture of flags, prisoners, and headlines. He had no patience for the slow, careful, dangerous work of screening, of probing enemy positions, of patiently gathering information. The thick fog, the dense forests of Thuringia, and the confused, crisscrossing, headless movements of the Prussian army itself had created a chaotic picture. The Prussians, led by a bickering committee of generals, barely knew where their own units were. How could the French? Napoleon, so often a master of reading the fog of war, had this time seen exactly what he wanted to see. He saw a large army, assumed it was the only army, and fixated on it with singular, obsessive purpose. His entire plan, his entire disposition of forces, was built on this one colossal error. He was sending almost half his available force at Jena against what was ultimately the smaller secondary threat, while sending only 2 corps, and as it would tragically turn out, only 1, against the main enemy force. The orders sent to Davout and Bernadotte were a masterpiece of flawed assumptions. They were instructed to support the Emperor's main attack, but they were being sent away from it, into the unknown, toward a target that did not exist in the way Napoleon imagined. And then there was the fatal ambiguity of the orders given to Marshal Bernadotte. This was the friction, the human element, that would turn a miscalculation into a near disaster. The relationship between Davout and Bernadotte was famously, virulently toxic. They despised each other. Bernadotte, the future king of Sweden, was fiercely proud, intensely jealous of his rivals, and a notorious political schemer who had never fully shed his revolutionary, republican ideals. He looked down on the new imperial nobility. Davout, by contrast, was a blunt, demanding professional, a stern disciplinarian who despised Bernadotte's vanity, his political manoeuvring, and his lax command. And Napoleon, who often gave vague, discretionary orders to his marshals, expecting them to use their initiative and march to the sound of the guns, had just thrown these 2 rivals together, alone, deep in enemy territory. The order stated, approximately, that if Bernadotte was with Davout at Naumburg, they could march together toward Auerstedt. But if he was not, if he had already marched to a different town, Dornburg, he should continue from there. It was an either-or order given to a man who craved independent glory and detested his assigned partner. Bernadotte, receiving the orders, made his choice. It was a choice that would be debated for a century, one that Napoleon would later, in exile on St. Helena, call outright treason. He chose to interpret the order in the way that kept him independent. He was close enough to Davout. He could have marched with him, but the order gave him an out. He chose the out. He would not march with Davout. He would not march to Auerstedt. He would take his entire First Corps, 20,000 strong, on a leisurely, pointless, and strategically irrelevant march between the 2 battlefields. It was a decision of catastrophic selfishness. The unwritten, sacred rule of the Grande Armée was marcher au canon. March to the sound of the guns. You march to support your comrades, regardless of orders. Bernadotte would spend the entire day of October 14th marching his men within earshot of the cannons of both Jena and Auerstedt, and fire not a single shot in either. So the die was cast. As the first grey light of dawn broke on October 14th, Napoleon was preparing his grand assault at Jena, convinced he was about to win the war. Miles away, Marshal Bernadotte was preparing his corps for a long, quiet walk. And Louis-Nicolas Davout, the Iron Marshal, with his single, unsupported Third Corps of 27,000 men, was marching west through the thick, clinging fog. He was obeying his Emperor's orders perfectly. He was marching to find the Prussian rear. Instead, the Duke of Brunswick, the King of Prussia, and 63,000 men were marching straight at him. The greatest mismatch of the Napoleonic Wars was about to begin. The fog was a cold, wet shroud. At 6 o'clock in the morning on October 14th, 1806, The world was reduced to the sound of thousands of marching feet and the rhythmic, metallic creak of leather and steel. Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout, the Iron Marshal, rode near the front of his column, his thick spectacles useless in the dense, grey mist. He was relying instead on his ears, his maps, and the reports of his lead elements. His Third Corps, the finest in the Grande Armée, was moving. They were marching west, just as the Emperor had commanded, on the single road that led through the Cursen Pass and toward the village of Auerstedt. Their objective was Apolda, the choke point on the main highway to Berlin. Their mission, as they understood it, was simple: to sweep around the flank of the main Prussian army, an army that Napoleon himself was, at that very moment, preparing to annihilate 15 miles to the south at Jena. The air was heavy with moisture, muffling sound, creating a claustrophobic, spectral atmosphere. Davout, a man of precise calculations, was expecting to find the panicked, broken remnants of a defeated enemy. He was expecting a pursuit, perhaps a skirmish, not a battle. His lead division, commanded by the brilliant, utterly reliable General Gudin, pushed forward, descending from the pass onto the small, fog-choked plain. Gudin's men, roughly 8,000 of the Third Corps' finest, were the tip of the spear. Their voltigeur companies, the elite light infantry, fanned out ahead, disappearing into the grey emptiness like ghosts. Then from the gloom came a sound, a single musket shot, a flat, dead pop in the heavy air. Then another, and another. The lead voltigeurs of the 25th Line Infantry Regiment stopped. They squinted into the fog. They could see shapes now, dark, looming masses moving through the mist. Prussian cavalry patrols? A rearguard? The French skirmishers took cover behind low hedges and in ditches, and opened fire. The shapes fired back, and the sound of the return fire was not the scattered crackle of a cavalry picket. It was the rolling, disciplined thunder of platoon volleys. And worse, far worse, the sound of artillery. A cannonball screamed blindly out of the fog and smashed into the head of the French column, killing 3 men instantly. This was no rearguard. This was something else entirely. At that moment, as if a curtain were being ripped aside by a colossal hand, a sudden gust of wind tore the fog apart. The grey void vanished. In its place, stretching across the plateau, filling the entire horizon, was a sea of blue. The entire Prussian army. It was not thousands, it was tens of thousands, regiment after regiment of infantry, deploying into perfect, menacing lines, squadron after squadron of cavalry, a glittering, endless mass of steel and horseflesh. Batteries of artillery, dozens of them, wheeling into position. And at their head, visible in the sudden, terrible clarity, was the King of Prussia himself, surrounded by his full general staff and the Duke of Brunswick. Gudin's 8,000 men had just walked blindly into the teeth of 63,000 Prussians. The shock was absolute. A report, frantic, near panicked, reached Davout just as he too spurred his horse forward. He raised his telescope. His nearsighted eyes struggled to focus, but the vision was horrifyingly clear. This was not the flank. This was not the rear. This was the main body. This was the heart of the Prussian army. In that single, terrible second, Davout's precise mathematical mind processed a cascade of catastrophic revelations. 1. The Emperor was wrong. He was 15 miles away at Jena, attacking a shadow. 2. This was the decisive battle, and Napoleon was not here. 3. Marshal Bernadotte, who was supposed to be marching with him, who should have been right beside him, was nowhere to be seen. Davout could hear Bernadotte's cannons firing, but they were faint, miles to the south, engaged in a pointless, minor skirmish. Davout was completely, utterly alone. He had 27,000 men in his entire corps. Only 8,000 were on the field. The other two divisions, under Friant and Morin, were strung out for miles behind him on the narrow road, still force-marching to catch up. He was outnumbered at this precise moment by at least 7-1. A lesser man would have broken. A lesser man would have ordered an immediate, desperate retreat. A retreat that would have collapsed into a rout, destroying the Third Corps and quite possibly losing the entire war. But this was Louis-Nicolas Davout. He was the Iron Marshal. He did not panic. He did not hesitate. He thought. He saw the Prussian army, but he also saw their slowness. They were deploying, methodically, cautiously, like a museum piece being carefully unwrapped. They were not charging. They were forming their perfect Frederican lines, taking an agonizing amount of time to get every battalion into its proper, textbook position. And that slowness, that rigid adherence to their 18th century doctrine, was the only gift they gave him. It was a gift of time, minutes, perhaps an hour. He would use every second. He turned to his aides, his voice sharp, precise, cutting through the growing roar of cannon fire. "Ride, find Friant, find Morand, tell them to drop their baggage, tell them to double time, tell them to run. Tell them the Third Corps is in battle for its life and for the honour of the Emperor. They must arrive. They will arrive." The aides scattered, galloping their horses back down the column, screaming for the divisions to accelerate. Now Davout turned his attention to the battlefield. He had 8,000 men. He could not hold a line in the open. To try would be suicide. The Prussian cavalry alone would ride them down in minutes. He needed an anchor, a fortress, and he saw it. A small, unremarkable village straddling the road. Hassenhausen. It was a cluster of solid stone-walled farmhouses, barns and gardens, surrounded by low hedges and ditches. It was not a fortress, but Davout would make it one. "Gudin," he ordered, "seize the village. Hold it at all costs. It is the key to the battle. It is the key to our survival." Gudin, a general as cool and professional as his commander, did not question the order. He understood instantly. His division, the 25th, the 85th, the 12th, and the 21st Line Infantry, poured into the small village. They became a furious swarm of engineers. They barricaded the narrow streets with carts, furniture, anything they could find. They smashed loopholes into the stone walls of the houses, creating firing positions. They positioned their cannons at the main entrances to the village, loaded with canister shot, turning the roads into killing zones. They lined the hedges and ditches on either side. In less than 30 minutes, the village of Hassenhausen had become a bristling granite stronghold, a fortress of bayonets and muskets, and they were ready just in time. The Prussian commanders, having recovered from their own surprise, were now acting. The Duke of Brunswick, cautious to a fault, had spent precious time deploying his army as if for a parade, rather than launching an immediate, overwhelming assault. He believed he had time. He believed he was facing only a single, isolated French division that could be dealt with methodically. He ordered his lead division, commanded by General von Schmettau, to advance and clear the French from the village. It was an order given with the casual confidence of a man who believes he holds all the cards. Schmettau's division, 12,000 strong, advanced. They came on in the classic, beautiful and fatally flawed Prussian style. Perfect lines, 3 ranks deep, drums beating the slow, steady rhythm of the parade ground advance. Officers marching bravely at their designated positions. They were a magnificent sight, a wall of blue and white, a living embodiment of the legacy of Frederick. They expected the French rabble to break and run at the very sight of them. But the men in Hassenhausen were not rabble. They were the veterans of the Third Corps. They were hidden. They were protected. And they were waiting. Davout's tirailleurs, his elite skirmishers, fanned out from the village, using the last of the fog and the cover of the hedges to pick off the Prussian officers. Captains, sergeants, drummers, the men who held the rigid lines together, began to fall. The perfect Prussian lines began to waver, to bunch up, losing their pristine cohesion before they had even fired a shot. Still, they came on. They got to within 100 yards. The French skirmishers fell back to the village walls. The Prussian officers shouted the order to fire, a single, massive, crashing volley. Most of it, fired at stone walls and empty air, was wasted. And then, from every loophole, from behind every barricade, from every hedge, Goudin's division answered. It was not a single volley. It was a continuous, rolling, ripping storm of musket fire, disciplined, aimed, and devastating. The front rank of the Prussian attack simply evaporated. It ceased to exist. The survivors reeled, tried to reload, but the fire from the village was relentless. Schmettau's attack had broken before it ever reached the barricades. The first wave had failed, leaving a carpet of blue uniforms on the damp fields. The Battle of Auerstedt had begun, and the Iron Marshal, outnumbered and alone, had just drawn first blood. The first Prussian assault had failed, shattered against the stone walls and disciplined musketry of Goudin's division. The ground in front of Hasenhausen was a mangled ruin of blue uniforms, a testament to the devastating power of veteran French infantry fighting from cover. But this was only the prelude. The Prussian army was not a small, fragile force. It was a behemoth, and it had been angered. On the Prussian side, there was shock, confusion, and a rising aristocratic rage. Their commanders, including the 71-year-old Duke of Brunswick, could not comprehend what was happening. Their mental map of the world, a map where Prussians were the masters of war and the French were revolutionary rabble, was being torn apart before their very eyes. This could not be the main French army. It was an impossibility. It had to be an isolated, sacrificial unit, an impudent roadblock that simply needed to be cleared. Brunswick, clinging to his outdated Frederican textbook, did not adapt. He did not pause to analyze this new, ferocious style of fighting. He did not wait to gather his overwhelming numerical superiority for a single, coordinated, crushing blow. Instead, he doubled down on the failed tactic. He would simply send more men into the same meat grinder. He ordered the next division forward. General von Wartensleben's corps, another 12,000 men, were commanded to advance and simply sweep the French away. They would not fail where Schmettau had. But the Prussian command structure, so perfect on the parade ground, so rigid in its theory, was already beginning to collapse under the friction of real combat. The fog, the unexpected resistance, the sheer shock of the French musketry, it had all created a fatal lag in their decision-making. The attacks became staggered, uncoordinated. They were feeding their army into Davout's machine piece by piece. The Duke of Brunswick himself, impatient and frustrated by the delay, by the sheer impudence of these Frenchmen, rode forward to personally supervise the next assault. He rode toward the sound of the guns, trying to impose his will on a battle he no longer understood. It was a fatal, gallant, and foolish mistake. The Prussian infantry advanced again. They were brave. They were disciplined. They marched in those same beautiful, slow, perfect lines, drums beating the steady advance, right back into the storm of lead. And the men of Goudin's division, now grimly confident, were waiting. The volleys ripped out from the stone walls, from the ditches, from the farmhouse windows. But this time, the French tirailleurs, the elite skirmishers, had a new focus. They were not just firing into the mass, they were hunting. They were looking for the officers, for the glittering uniforms, for the men on horseback, and they found them. As the Duke of Brunswick peered through the smoke, trying to make sense of the chaos, a single French skirmisher, hidden in a ditch perhaps 200 yards away, levelled his musket. He fired. The ball, a piece of lead weighing just under an ounce, struck the Duke in the face, smashing through both eyes and into his brain. He fell from his horse, mortally wounded. At almost the same moment, General von Schmettau, commander of the 1st Division, was also hit, collapsing with a severe wound. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Prussian army was suddenly, completely decapitated. In the space of 15 minutes, both their commander-in-chief and their lead divisional general were struck down. The entire central command structure had evaporated. King Frederick William III was on the field. Yes, but he was a king, not a general. He was incapable of making a tactical decision to save his own life, let alone his army. He watched, horrified, as his generals fell and his army began to stall, the perfect lines wavering, the advance faltering. He turned to the aged General von Moellendorff, another veteran in his 70s. But there was no plan. There was only confusion, reaction, and a rising tide of French firepower. The Prussian army, 63,000 strong, was now a confused, terrified, headless giant. But on the French side, the crucible was just as hot. Gudin's division was dying. They had been fighting for nearly 2 hours against overwhelming numbers. They had repelled 2 massive assaults. But they were bleeding. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Carts were desperately trying to ferry powder and shot forward, but the demand was overwhelming. Their cannon barrels were overheating, some becoming too hot to safely load. Their muskets were fouling from the constant black powder, the barrels sticky, the flints wearing down. Men were falling, the casualty lists growing by the minute. Gudin himself, riding calmly behind the line, knew his division was at its absolute limit. They were exhausted. They could see more Prussians gathering on the hills, wave upon wave of them. Gudin could not hold forever. He was a rock, but even a rock can be worn away by a relentless sea. Davout, riding his horse just behind the village, his face impassive, his spectacles covered in the grime of battle, knew he was in a desperate race against time. He needed his reinforcements. He strained his eyes, peering back down the road through the Kherson Pass, listening. Listening for the one sound that could save them. And then, above the roar of battle, above the screams and the endless crash of musketry, he heard it. Drums. French drums. Beating the pas de charge, the quick, aggressive rhythm of the attack. It was General Friant's division. They had marched at double time for miles, hearing the thunder of the guns, knowing their comrades in the 3rd Corps were in desperate trouble. They were not fresh. They were winded, sweating, their legs burning from the forced march. But they were here. Davout wasted no time. He was not a man to celebrate relief. He was a man to exploit it. He did not make the obvious, conventional and wrong decision to send Friant's men into the village to reinforce Gudin's bloodied troops. That would just create a denser target. It would plug the dam, but it wouldn't redirect the river. This was the moment of tactical genius. He ordered Friant to deploy to the right of Hassenhausen. He used Gudin's exhausted division as the immovable anvil. He would use Friant's fresh division as the hammer. Friant's men, veterans all, deployed from marching columns into battle lines almost as they ran. Their fresh ranks, numbering around 10,000, extended the French flank, threatening to envelop the Prussian left, which was still trying to organize its uncoordinated assault on Hassenhausen. The Prussians, disorganized and leaderless, saw this new threat appearing on their flank and panicked. They tried to shift forces, to refuse the flank in the military language of the day, to create a new defensive line. But it was too late. They were now being attacked, not just held. The battle now entered its most brutal phase. It was no longer a skirmish at a village. It was a full-scale, grinding infantry battle in the open fields to the right of Hassenhausen. For the next hour, it was a point-blank, agonizing firefight. This was the crucible. This was the moment the 18th century died, and the 19th century was born in blood and iron. On one side, the Prussian infantry. They were magnificent. They were brave. And they were obsolete. They stood in their rigid, two-rank lines, shoulder to shoulder, firing disciplined volleys as Frederick had taught them. Their officers walked bravely in front of the line, as tradition dictated, to keep the men steady, making them perfect targets. They were a wall of blue. On the other side, the French. They did not fight in a single line. They fought in a hybrid system that Davout and his generals had perfected. In the front, a swarm of tirailleurs, skirmishers, spread out in pairs. They were not standing in the open. They were lying prone. They were kneeling behind hedges. They were using every fold in the ground for cover. And they were not firing volleys into the mass. They were aiming. They were hunting. They were pouring a precise, rapid, and murderous fire into the static Prussian ranks. Behind this deadly skirmish screen, the main French battalions waited in columns, ready to surge forward and deliver a decisive bayonet charge the moment the Prussian line wavered. The Prussian soldiers, standing stoically as their officers were picked off one by one, were in an impossible situation. They were firing their slow, methodical volleys into a cloud of smoke, from which 100 invisible enemies were shooting back at them with deadly accuracy. Their training had not prepared them for this. This was not war as they understood it. This was chaos. This was murder. They were fighting blind, and they had no leaders. The decapitated command structure meant no one was coordinating the attacks. No one was shifting reserves. No one was responding to the growing French threat on their flank. They were simply being fed into the fight, regiment by regiment, to be ground down. The Prussian infantry, the inheritors of Frederick's iron discipline, were dying. They were being systematically, scientifically, and ruthlessly dismantled. The volleys from the houses and hedges of Hassenhausen, combined with the relentless, aimed fire from Friant skirmishers on their flank, were doing more than just killing men. They were killing a legend. The Prussian lines, so perfect on the parade ground, were wavering, bunching, and in some places beginning to dissolve. Their officers, who bravely walked in front of the ranks to steady them, were being hunted, picked off one by French sharpshooters, who understood that killing the shepherd scatters the sheep. And the Prussian High Command, the brain that should have been directing this vast, powerful body, was gone. Brunswick was dead. Schmettau was gravely wounded. King Frederick William III, a monarch, not a commander, was paralysed. He watched, horrified, as his beautiful, invincible army was being bled white by a force it should have brushed aside. He had no plan. He was surrounded by aged generals offering contradictory, panicked advice. The Prussian war machine was grinding to a halt, leaderless, confused, and hemorrhaging blood. But one man on that field was never paralysed. One man embodied the raw animal spirit of the Prussian army, a spirit that predated the delicate tactics of Frederick. Gebhard von Blücher, Marshal Vorwärts, General Forward. The 64-year-old cavalry general, his face a roadmap of old scars and fury, had been watching the infantry battle with growing apoplectic rage. This was not war. This was butchery. His infantry was being murdered because their commanders were too slow, too old, too timid. He would not stand by and watch it happen. He saw the French infantry, still outnumbered, now extended in a line to the right of the village, their flanks seemingly open. He saw his own cavalry, the elite of the Prussian army, tens of thousands of them, held in reserve, chomping at their bits, waiting. He would wait no longer. He did not ask the king. He did not wait for an order. He acted. He roared the command. He would shatter these impudent French squares with the sheer, irresistible weight of Prussian steel. Then, across the field, the survivors of Gudin's and Friant's divisions saw a new, more terrible sight. The remnants of the Prussian infantry were pulling back, but in their place the entire horizon began to move. It was the glitter of steel, thousands of breastplates, a forest of sabres, 10,000 horsemen, perhaps 12,000 were forming up in the open ground. This was the Prussian reserve cavalry, the entire mass of them, regiment after regiment of heavy cuirassiers, dragoons, and hussars. They were the thunder held in reserve, and they were about to be unleashed. For the French infantry, this was the moment that every soldier in the Napoleonic Wars dreaded most. They were in the open. They were exhausted from hours of fighting. Their ammunition was low, and the most feared cavalry in Europe was about to charge them. Davout, riding his horse calmly behind the lines, saw the threat before it even fully formed. His voice, cold and precise, cut through the din of the fading infantry battle. The bugles screamed, "Formez les carrés!" Form the squares. The French infantry, veterans of 100 skirmishes, knew this drill by heart. It was the ultimate test. The battalions of Gudin and Friant, which had been fighting in flexible lines and skirmish screens, now pulled in on themselves with breathtaking speed. They became living fortresses. Hollow squares of men, 4 ranks deep. The front rank knelt, their muskets angled outwards, the bayonets planted firmly in the ground to create a bristling, unbreakable hedge of steel, a cheval de frise of human courage. The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th ranks stood behind them, muskets loaded, levelled, ready. Their officers and their regimental eagles, the sacred standards given to them by the Emperor, were safe inside the hollow centre. The French artillery, what little Davout had, was positioned in the gaps between the squares, loaded not with cannonballs, but with canister. They had become giant shotguns, ready to blast holes in the charging mass. The French infantrymen held their breath. They could feel the ground begin to tremble, a low, distant drumming that grew into a rolling thunder. Blücher raised his sabre. The trumpets screamed. The ground began to shake. This was not a tactical manoeuvre. This was an avalanche. 10,000 horsemen, a tidal wave of flesh and steel, spurred their horses into a gallop. They came on. The Prussian officers at the front, the sound of their shouts lost in the roar of thousands of hooves. The French infantrymen in the squares watched them come. This was the test of their discipline, the test of their trust in Davout, the test of their training. Every instinct screamed to run, to turn, to hide. But they held. They knew that as long as the square remained unbroken, they were invincible. The moment it broke, they were all dead. So they held. Their sergeants walked calmly behind the ranks, their voices low and steady. "Hold your fire, lads. Hold your fire. Wait for the command. Wait. Let them come closer." The wave was 200 yards away, a deafening, terrifying wall of motion. 100 yards. The faces of the riders were visible now, contorted in the fury of the charge. 50 yards. The sound was a physical blow. 30 yards. Phew! Fire! The command ripped down the line. The squares on the French right flank, The battalions of Friant's division erupted in a simultaneous rolling crash of fire. Thousands of muskets, supplemented by the cannons firing blasts of canister, discharged at point-blank range into the face of the charge. The front wave of Prussian cuirassiers hit the French squares like a tsunami hitting a granite cliff. It simply ceased to exist. Horses screamed as the heavy lead balls tore through them. Riders, blasted from their saddles, were thrown into the wall of bayonets. The charge, so magnificent in its inception, dissolved into a chaotic, swirling, dying mass of panicked animals and desperate men. Horses, mad with terror, refused the final, fatal leap into the bayonets, rearing up, turning and crashing into the ranks behind them. The Prussian charge, so powerful, had failed to break a single square. It was a nightmare of screaming horses, snapping bayonets, and point-blank musket fire. The cuirassiers, their armour designed to deflect sabre cuts, offered no protection against French musketry at this range. The charge, so magnificent in its inception, dissolved into a chaotic, swirling mass of panicked animals and desperate men. The survivors, perhaps two-thirds of the initial wave, wheeled their bleeding, terrified horses and galloped back, leaving a horrific barrier of dead and dying men and animals in front of the French squares. But Blücher was not a man to accept reality. He was a creature of pure, incandescent rage. His infantry had failed. His first charge had failed. The only answer was to charge again. He rallied his shattered squadrons, mixing them with fresh regiments that had not yet been committed. He screamed at them, cursed them, called them cowards, and physically drove them back toward the battle. They charged again, but the French were ready. This was no longer a desperate defence. This was a systematic execution. The squares held. The volleys ripped out. More horses fell. More men died. The charge broke even faster this time. Still, Blücher would not stop. He rallied them a third time, and a fourth. He led some of the charges himself, his grey hair streaming, his sabre flashing, like some ancient god of war. His horse was shot out from under him. He was trapped for a moment under the dying animal, saved only by the discipline of his officers who dragged him free. He was spent. His cavalry was broken. They were no longer a cohesive fighting force. They were just scattered, terrified survivors, milling about in confusion, their spirits shattered, their horses exhausted. The greatest cavalry force in Europe had been destroyed. And then, at the height of this cavalry spasm, as Blücher's horsemen were bleeding themselves dry against the immovable squares of Friant, the final piece of Davout's army arrived, General Moran's division. The 3rd Division of the 3rd Corps, having marched all morning, finally cleared the pass and began to deploy on Davout's left flank, north of Hassenhausen. They were fresh, they were eager, and their arrival sealed the battlefield. Davout's line was no longer a single, desperate anchor point. It was a solid 3-division front. Gudin in the centre at Hassenhausen, bloodied but unbeaten. Friant on the right, having just annihilated the Prussian cavalry. And now Moran on the left, advancing to threaten the Prussian right flank, which had done almost nothing all day. The Prussians had thrown everything they had at the French. Their infantry had failed. Their command was dead. And now their legendary cavalry was broken. The battle was not yet over, but it was lost. It was over. The Prussian cavalry, the glorious inheritors of Frederick's charges, were no longer an army. They were a shattered, bleeding, exhausted mob, streaming back in disorganized clumps, leaving behind a horrific landscape of dead and dying horses that formed a gruesome barrier in front of the French squares. Blücher was defeated. His spirit, though not his rage, was broken. And the Prussian infantry, who had watched this final, desperate, suicidal gamble fail so completely, felt their last reserves of courage evaporate. They had been fighting for 6 hours. They were leaderless. Their infantry assaults had failed. Their cavalry assaults had failed. They had thrown their entire operational playbook at this one small village, and the village still stood. The French had not broken. The French had not retreated. And now, to their absolute horror, the French line, which had been a static, defensive fortress of bayonets for 3 agonizing hours, began to move. On the French left, the final, decisive piece of Davout's army had at last arrived, General Moran's division. The 3rd Division of the 3rd Corps, having marched all morning hearing the battle rage ahead of them, finally cleared the pass. They were fresh. They were eager. They had not been bled white in the crucible of Hassenhausen. They had not had to endure the psychological terror of Blücher's cavalry charges. They were, in effect, a new army arriving on a field of exhausted men. Marshal Davout, riding his horse calmly behind the lines, his face an impassive mask, his spectacles covered in the grime of battle, saw them deploy. He saw his line was now complete. Gudin in the centre at Hassenhausen, his division a shadow, perhaps 40% of its men dead or wounded, but unbroken. Friant on the right, his men standing grim-faced amidst the carnage of the cavalry, their squares still intact. And now Morand on the left, advancing to threaten the Prussian right flank. A flank commanded by the Prince of Orange, which had done almost nothing all day but shuffle and reposition. The Prussians had thrown everything they had at the French. Their infantry had failed. Their command was dead. And now their legendary cavalry was broken. The battle was not yet over, but it was lost. Davout, a man of mathematics and cold calculation, saw the pivot point, the precise fleeting moment when the balance of an entire battle, an entire war, shifts. He had been the anvil, absorbing the blows of a hammer 60,000 strong. Now he would be the hammer. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, the bugles of the 3rd Corps screamed a new set of commands. Not form square, not hold. The call was the pas de charge, the advance. All along the 3-mile front, the entire French line surged forward. This was the iron fist. This was the moment of transformation. The men of Gudin's division, the heroes who had held Hassenhausen against impossible odds for 6 bloody hours, exhausted, their faces black with powder, their ammunition almost gone, somehow found the strength. The barricades they had built were torn down. They fixed their bayonets and charged out of the village they had so desperately defended, screaming the revolution's war cries. They fell upon the shocked Prussian infantry in front of them, who had believed the fight in the centre was over. This was a psychological masterstroke. The fortress was attacking them. On their right, Friant's division, the men who had just repulsed Blücher, did not rest. They did not celebrate. They executed one of the most difficult manoeuvres in warfare. They reformed from their defensive squares back into attacking columns. This is a manoeuvre that is difficult on a parade ground. To do it on a battlefield littered with thousands of dead and dying horses under the eyes of a defeated but still present enemy required a level of training and discipline that seems almost supernatural. But the 3rd Corps was that good. They stepped over the carnage, they formed their columns, and they advanced, rolling up the shattered remnants of the Prussian left. This was a push against a broken door. But the decisive blow, the iron fist itself, came from Morand on the French left. His division was fresh. They were angry. They had marched all morning hearing their comrades dying, and now it was their turn. They advanced with parade ground precision. their volleys rolling, their drums beating. They were not aiming at a village. They were aiming at the exposed flank of the Prussian right wing. The Prussians, commanded by the Prince of Orange, tried to turn, tried to form a new line to face this fresh, terrifying threat. But it was impossible. How do you ask men who have watched their army die for 6 hours, men who have been standing in reserve, their morale seeping away with every cannon shot, to suddenly pivot and fight a fresh, elite enemy attacking from a new direction? They broke. The Prussian right wing simply dissolved. It turned and ran, abandoning their cannons, their standards, their discipline. This collapse was contagious. It was a virus of panic, and it ripped down the entire Prussian line. The centre, seeing the right flank vanish, also broke. The left, already mauled by Friant, followed suit. In the space of perhaps 30 minutes, the entire 63,000-man Prussian army, the most feared military machine in Europe, ceased to exist as a coherent force. It became a panicked, terrified mob of individuals running for their lives. King Frederick William III himself was swept up in the rout. He had watched his commander-in-chief die. He had watched his elite cavalry get slaughtered. Now he saw his army, his entire kingdom, dissolve before his eyes. He was forced to turn his horse and flee the field, galloping back toward the safety of his kingdom, his royal pride, his army, and the legacy of Frederick the Great, all dying behind him. Davout's small, exhausted cavalry force, led by General Viant, now did what they had been waiting to do all day. They were too few to win a battle, but they were the perfect instrument to finish one. They were let loose. This was not a battle-winning charge. It was a pursuit. They harried the retreating mob. They did not stop to fight. They were the wolves chasing a scattered herd, cutting down stragglers, capturing cannons, preventing any attempt to rally, turning a retreat into a rout. And all the while, Davout sat on his horse on the captured ridge, his exhausted men securing the prize. They had captured over 100 Prussian cannons, thousands of prisoners, and the entire Prussian baggage train. But as he watched the pursuit, the Iron Marshal scanned the horizon. He looked south, toward Jena. He listened. He was listening for the guns of the First Corps. He was waiting for Marshal Bernadotte's 20,000 fresh troops to appear on the Prussian flank and turn this overwhelming victory into a total, war-ending annihilation. If Bernadotte arrived now, the entire Prussian royal family, who had been on the field, would be captured. The war would be over. Today. But the horizon remained empty. The only sounds were the moans of the wounded and the distant, triumphant shouts of his own pursuing cavalry. Marshal Bernadotte, who had spent the day marching aimlessly between the two great battles, never came. Davout looked at his corps, his 27,000 men. They had just fought and beaten 63,000 Prussians. They had inflicted perhaps 13,000 casualties. They had destroyed an army, but they had suffered staggering losses themselves. Nearly 8,000 of his own men were dead or wounded, 1 man in 3. His divisions were shattered, his men were bleeding. His generals, Gudin and Friant, were both wounded. He was the master of the field, but he was the master alone. The Third Corps had done the impossible. They had not just survived, they had conquered. As the last remnants of the Prussian army vanished into the twilight, Marshal Davout, his uniform torn, his face black with powder, finally allowed himself to sit. Around him, his corps, what was left of it, was a wreck. Nearly 8,000 of his men were casualties, a staggering toll of almost 30%. The ground was a carpet of bodies, French and Prussian, piled highest around the stone walls of Hassenhausen. But they held the field. They had captured over 100 Prussian cannons. They had shattered the finest cavalry in Europe. And they had defeated the main Prussian army, commanded by its king. Davout, a man of logistics and facts, wrote his report to the emperor. It was precise, factual. It detailed the enemy's strength, 63,000. It detailed his own, 27,000. It detailed the result, total victory. He dispatched his aide-de-camp, a young colonel, on the grueling 15-mile ride south to Napoleon's headquarters at Jena, fully expecting praise for his corps and for his generals. That messenger arrived at a scene of total euphoria. Napoleon was at his zenith. He too had won a stunning victory, shattering Prince Hohenlohe's 40,000 Prussians at Jena. He was surrounded by his marshals, Lannes, Ney, Soult, all congratulating him on his decisive battle. The emperor was dictating the history of the campaign, a history where he was the protagonist, he was the victor. Into this scene of celebration rode Davout's exhausted messenger. He presented the report. Napoleon read it. He read it again. The room fell silent. The emperor looked up, his face clouded with a mixture of confusion and irritation. He turned to his chief of staff, Berthier. "Your marshal must be seeing double," he famously snapped. It was a joke, but it was not funny. It was the sound of an ego refusing to process reality. Seeing double? 63,000 men? The King of Prussia? Impossible. He had just fought the main army. He was the victor of the campaign. Davout, he assumed, must have encountered a detached corps, panicked, and inflated the numbers to make his own fight seem more glorious. The report was an annoyance, an exaggeration. It distracted from the real victory, his victory. But as the hours passed, the truth became undeniable. The flood of prisoners confirmed it. The captured generals, the abandoned standards, the sheer panic scale of the rout fleeing from the north, all pointed to one terrifying, inescapable fact. Napoleon had been wrong. He had thrown his main force against the Prussian flank guard, while Davout, alone and unsupported, had met and defeated the Prussian centre. The emperor, a supreme pragmatist, understood. He also understood that history is not what happens. It is what is written. On October 15th, the fifth bulletin of the Grande Armée was published. It was the official narrative of the campaign, the text that would be read by millions across Europe, the first draft of history. It was a masterpiece of propaganda. It spoke of one great shattering battle, the Battle of Jena. It described in epic detail how the emperor, with his brilliant manoeuvres, had crushed the Prussian army. And Auerstedt? Davout's 6-hour struggle against double his numbers? It was mentioned. Oh yes, it was mentioned. It was described as a secondary engagement, a wing of the main battle, where the brave Third Corps under Marshal Davout had done its duty in blocking the retreat of the army Napoleon was already defeating at Jena. The narrative was set. The world learned of one great victory, Jena. Davout's masterpiece, a battle that was tactically purer and strategically more significant, was reduced to a footnote in the emperor's grand epic. The credit was stolen. But Napoleon was two men. He was the propagandist who controlled the narrative, and he was the cold realist who knew the truth. He could lie to the world, but he could not lie to himself. He knew who had truly won the campaign. When the marshals were rewarded, Napoleon, in a private gesture that spoke louder than any bulletin, granted Davout the highest honour imaginable. He created him the Duke of Auerstedt. It was the ultimate acknowledgement. The emperor knew, the army knew, and Davout, the Iron Marshal, knew. He had done his duty. And what of the man who had abandoned him? What of Marshal Bernadotte, who had marched his 20,000 men aimlessly between the two battles? his soldiers hearing the cannons of both, but firing a shot in neither? Napoleon was incandescent with rage. He nearly had him court-martialed and shot. According to the laws of war, the emperor wrote, Bernadotte should be shot. But he did not. Bernadotte was family, married to Napoleon's first love, Désirée Clary, whose sister was married to his own brother, Joseph. Politics and the complex web of family saved him. Bernadotte would live on to eventually betray Napoleon entirely and become King of Sweden. But Davout would live on as the Duke of Auerstedt, the man who had done the impossible, the man who had saved the emperor from his own mistake, and the man who, in the official histories, would never truly get the credit he deserved. The victory at Auerstedt, that brutal, necessary conquest, was not simply a tactical win. It was a proof of concept. Napoleon won the headlines at Jena, but Davout won the war, shattering the main Prussian army and erasing the legacy of Frederick the Great in a single, terrifying day. But Davout's greatest achievement was not at Auerstedt alone. It was his consistency. It was the absolute, unyielding professionalism that marked his entire career. He was the marshal who never lost a major battle commanding a corps. In a military filled with brilliant, flawed, and often defeated geniuses, Davout was the only one. He took the principles that won at Hassenhausen, discipline, logistics, training, and the brutal exploitation of enemy error, and applied them everywhere. At Eckmühl in 1809, he held the line, again outnumbered, buying Napoleon the time he needed to defeat the Austrians. At Borodino in 1812, he was severely wounded, but his corps held the crucial centre against the massive Russian assault. He was, until the end, the ultimate professional, the emperor's anchor. His legacy is not a monument of glory, but a blueprint for competence. He proved that morale and initiative, the very qualities Sir John Moore championed, were more effective than aristocratic lineage or even sheer numbers. Davout's victory was won with spectacles and an obsessive focus on detail, not swagger. He was the man who did the impossible job while the glory went elsewhere. And perhaps that is why he remains the greatest of Napoleon's marshals, the one who truly embodied the iron will and precision that defined the empire. His name may be forgotten by the wider world, but his principles live on in every army that values discipline over dash. He was the unbreakable man who won the battles that mattered most.